In part 2 with Dr Joe Romm, we discuss how offsetting impacts the NDC accounting systems that underpin the Paris Agreement and expose much less well-off countries to yet another form of climate imperialism. In part 3 with Joe, we discuss how dodgy offsets and double accounting feed into COP28 and ask the question, is the COP process set up to fail? A link to Joe's in-depth paper on all of this is in the notes. Following episodes include a discussion with Mike Hands, founder of the Inga Tree Foundation, about regenerative agroforestry, providing a sustainable alternative to slash and burn, potentially improving the lives of millions of families living in the tropical zones and vastly reducing emissions from this climate-vulnerable region. I also discuss the unfolding tragedy of the world's coral reefs with marine biologist Professor Terry Hughes at the James Cook University in Queensland, Australia. These are two fascinating discussions going deep into ecology, both on land and at sea. Live now for all members is an interview with methane expert Dr Ewan Nisbet. Ewan discusses new observations of wetlands and how they could be signalling epochal change in the Earth system. At the COPs, I've heard a lot of discussion around double accounting and how it's become a real problem. Can you take us into that issue and just give us an overview of what's going on there?
If you want to move to a world where things are real, and now we're going to switch over from the voluntary market, which is not regulated, to what's called the compliance market, where people have to comply with a commitment that they made. So the European trading system, that's a compliance market, right? The countries in the EU have said, some have said we're going in this much, others said we're going in this much. But the point is they have made national commitments to do the following. So they've made an agreement amongst themselves, and the Paris Accord is also a similar type of agreement. So that's called a compliance market. Now, in the compliance market, everyone is actually doing real accounting. The double accounting problem is quite simple. Let's imagine we have the United States and Brazil. Let's say Brazil had 2 billion tons of carbon emissions a year, CO2 emissions a year, and the United States had 2 billion tons. So together we have 4 billion tons. Now, the United States says we're going to pay Brazil to reduce its easiest emissions reductions. So we're going to pay them to cut 1 billion emissions out, renewables, tree planting, all this sort of things, shut down some coal plants. So Brazil does this. They take the US money, they reduce their emissions from 2 billion down to 1 billion. So now the total emissions in the world are 3 billion. If, however, the United States said, hey, we paid for those emissions reductions, so we're offsetting 1 billion of our 2 billion and we're going down to 1. Well, all of a sudden, our total is 2, right? You and me. I have a pretend billion and you have real billion, right? So we're claiming that between us, we have 2 billion, but only 1 billion was actually really reduced. I've just doubled the amount of emissions reductions. So that is double counting. And clearly you can't allow that. Either I get to count the emissions and you don't, or you get to account the emissions reductions and I don't. So those are the two solutions, and those two solutions have been well known in the literature. They predate the Paris Accord. And when the Paris Accord was signed, everybody knew that there was going to be a negotiation to solve the double counting problem. In Paris in December 2015, I was there. The nation said, we're not going to be able to do all the accounting and the specifics of how you do trading and how you do offsets, right? So we're going to make this blanket overall agreement. And then in subsequent conference of the parties, we're going to come back and negotiate, and we'll negotiate during the year and vote on them during the COPs to actually implement it. So again, we come back. There's two solutions. One solution is that I, Brazil, get to count my billion tons reduction. So I actually go down from 2 to 1. And you, the United States, you paid for the project, but you don't get to count them. You did a good thing. You can say, I helped Brazil, I helped the world. I made a contribution to the world, to Brazil's inactions, but I don't get to count that as an offset. So I still have my 2 billion tons of emissions. So Brazil has 1 billion and I have 2 billion. So that solution to the double counting problem is to say, we're not going to do, it's not an offset, right? And we're going to call it something different. And in COP27 in Egypt, the world said, we're going to call that a mitigation contribution. And a 1 ton of mitigation contribution emission reduction You can support that, right? But it can't be used to say, hey, now I'm net zero, I'm making carbon neutral product, right? It is a good thing that I'm doing, but I don't get credit as, hey, a license to pollute, right? Only Brazil gets to count it for real. One solution to the double counting problem is no offsets. Obviously, however, there are people who like offsets because they sell and buy offsets. So the second solution is where the seller doesn't count the tons. And this is where things get tricky, right? Because the seller actually reduced their tons a billion, right? Brazil actually reduced its tons from 2 billion to 1 billion. But the only way it could pretend that it didn't is if it added the billion tons back to its baseline, right? If it told the world, I am officially not counting these emissions reductions in my inventory. So my official inventory, as far as the world concerned, is still 2 billion. I'm going to pretend I didn't do anything so that the rich country who paid for this can pretend that they did do something, right? So now the United States can pretend that it only has 1 billion tons in emissions when it really has 2, and I'm going to pretend that I have 2 billion when I only have 1. And this may seem kind of weird and odd, but this was what the world agreed to, in COP26. In Glasgow, the world agreed to two things: that the Paris Accord was going to set up something called an authorized offset. And this authorized offset was going to be the real deal. The purchaser of this offset gets to reduce their own emissions, gets to say that their own emissions are lower. So that requires, as I said, the seller to publicly announce to the world, officially on record, I'm not counting these emissions reductions, I'm going to add them back. And the adding back is something called the corresponding adjustment. And so people may have heard that term. I don't want to get too much into it, but it matters a lot, even though this is kind of tricky. It matters a lot for two reasons. One is that if I'm Brazil, and I've put in a lot of effort, the United States paid me money, I put in a lot of effort to do the easiest emissions reductions I can and actually lower my emissions to 1 billion tons. So I, Brazil, actually only have 1 billion tons left of my own. But from the world's point of view, I have 2 billion because I gave up in the corresponding adjustment. I've sold those off to the US. So my actual inventory is still sitting at 2 billion. So the point is, okay, if I actually reduce my remaining 1 billion, I still have this billion on my account. So I haven't gone to zero, even though I pledged the world that I'm going to zero, which Brazil and almost all the countries in the world have done so. So I'm going to have to go back. I have now made it much harder for me to achieve my climate target, right? Because I sold off my easiest to do tons. I'm going to have to go back into the market at some point and buy those tons from somebody else in maybe 10 or 15 years. But guess what? Those tons aren't going to be cheaper, right? The cheap stuff's been done. People are going to be doing like direct air capture stuff, pulling CO2 out of the air, hundreds of dollars a ton. Maybe they'll be a little cheaper. But the point is, the current offset market is in the few dollars a ton. So number one problem here is that the seller, the developing country, has let the rich country skim off the easy to do stuff and left me holding the bag for having to figure out how to solve my problem when the cost goes up. So this deal that was agreed to in COP26 basically said poor countries are going to be could be taken advantage of. We're going to do this deal, and we're going to make it easier for the United States to achieve its target because it just bought 1 billion cheap tons, and it's going to be harder for the developing country, right? So that seems kind of unfair. So there's a lot of quotes in my paper, this paper I did, for the University of Pennsylvania on offsets that hopefully you have a link on your site. A lot of quotes from developing country people saying this is just what the rich countries do. They make the rules and developing countries have to follow them and whatever the consequences are. So on the one hand, I would call this sort of climate colonialism or climate imperialism. But on the other hand, and this gets to the second issue, if I'm a developing country and I realize this, in other words, at some point when everyone in the world realizes this, they will realize, okay, if I sell off, if I do an authorized offset and I give up those tons and I do the corresponding adjustment, I'm not going to charge you this ridiculously low price that the phony offset market is, right? I'm going to charge you the fair value. Now, what is the fair value? Well, you, the rich country, were going to have to spend $100 a ton, $150 a ton to reduce your own emissions. So if you imagine there's a global market, let's leap 3 years ahead. Now, all these issues have been finished, resolved, signed to, and people are starting to meet their emissions reduction targets. Well, if the poor countries are selling off their tons for, let's say, 30 a ton, and the rich countries, if they did it themselves, it would cost them 100 a ton. Well, they're not going to do any of their own emissions reductions, right? They're just going to pay the poor countries. But that will bid up the price, right? And if you think about it from an economic perspective, the correct price of an offset in such a market where everyone is fully informed isn't the cost to me of doing the project. It's the cost to you if you had to do it yourself. It's your marginal cost of reducing your emissions. So the price of the offsets are going to rise, right? They're not going to be this imaginary cheap price. And one of the points that I make is one of the biggest bad things about the voluntary offset market is that it has fooled everybody into thinking that there was this abundance of cheap, easy tons sitting in the developing world ready to be bought. And therefore, I, rich country, or I, Microsoft, didn't have to do the own work of reducing my own emissions because what? There's infinite supply of cheap, free, get out of jail cards. So that was never true, right? Because the reason the voluntary offset tons were cheap is because they were meaningless, right? We already said the real tons, they're sitting up there around $100 a ton. So when everyone realizes this, those authorized offsets aren't going to be any different from any other, from the European trading system credits, right? They can't be. They have to rise in price. So it's really important, A, for developing countries to realize, please don't sell off these tons. You may think, hey, I'm getting $20 a ton, right? And that's a whole lot better than what the voluntary market was selling them for. Well, it is, but it's not what you deserve to be paid. And if you actually do this deal, it's going to cost you a lot of money in 10 or 15 years. And so it's your choice to do what you want with your tons. But I just wanted everyone to have the same facts so they could make the decision and understand the value of what they had. And I will make another aside, which is I think it would be very bad. You know, Switzerland is now going around the world, as you may know, buying up tons from developing countries. And they seem to be these official tons, even though, you know, that the world hasn't finished all of the, you know, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I don't think that these developing countries are selling them at a reasonable price. But here's the thing. The Paris Agreement, as the world should know, is not a mandatory market. There's no enforcement mechanism. There's no penalty if the United States doesn't meet its promised target, right? It's all voluntary, right? The United States has not passed a treaty through Congress saying this is what is the law of the land. The Paris was just good faith effort for all the countries to get together and collectively said, we're going to start reducing our emissions and ratcheting them down every 5 years. So if the rich countries were to start taking advantage of the poor countries, and in a few years, the poor countries said, wait a minute, you took advantage of us. There's nothing to stop those countries from saying, you took advantage of us. We're voiding all those deals. We actually reduced our own emissions, right? So you see, our actual number is actually lower. So you can't pretend anymore that yours are, right? So the point is, you don't want to screw people over when the whole market is based on good faith. You never really want to screw people over, but the point is, you can't really screw people over if at the end of the day they can say, there's no written contract that is enforceable. I'm going to undo what you just tried to do to me. So I think that it's really important for the world to understand that it doesn't cost $2 a ton to go to zero. It costs a lot of money, and developing countries deserve to get paid what the real value of their product is. And by the way, the other thing the developing countries could do is simply get together and form a cartel, right? I mean, that's what the oil company, right? OPEC did that, right? We're not going to sell cheap oil anymore, right? We're going to get together and charge you what you would pay for the oil.
Thank you for listening. A reminder that episodes appear weeks earlier for YouTube and Patreon members. This is due to my work schedule. However, support for the podcast enables this work to continue. Thank you.